A new book out just yesterday tries to tell the story of America through some very important speeches, but you might not know some of these speeches or the people who gave them. All We Say, The Battle for Our American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches, looks at remarks from luminaries such as Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention all the way until President Trump's second inauguration, and some interesting characters in American history in between. Earlier, I spoke with the author Ben Rhodes, former speechwriter for President Obama and an advisor, about the book and a lot more. We started with how he views the current state of negotiations with Iran. Here is some of that conversation. Ben Rhodes, I promise you, we will get to All We Say, the book. But I've got to talk to you about Iran. Yeah. I've got to talk to you about President Trump's orientation to the state of the war, the objectives, all the things that he continues to say, harshly critical of the nuclear deal President Obama negotiated with the Iranian regime. Yeah. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Major, you were there at the time.
I was.
Look, there are a lot of things that we did not get right in the Obama years. But I always felt like one thing we did get right was that nuclear deal with Iran. And our basic case at the time was there are only two ways to solve this problem of the Iranian nuclear program: a diplomatic agreement that is roughly like what we got. And you could argue whether certain provisions you might want to tighten or make longer, but the outlines of that kind of deal, or you'd have to use military force.
And the agreement that you put together was not just the United States and Iran. It was a multi-nation agreement with enforcement mechanisms.
And I think that that's the most important thing, because, again, you had the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. So you had not just the United States, Great Britain, and France. You had Russia and China in on the deal, Germany and the EU in on the deal. And then you had enforcement mechanisms that had inspections of the Iranian nuclear facilities and their uranium mines and mills. Like, so literally the entire supply chain, where they pulled the uranium out of the ground, how they enriched it. The stockpile had to be shipped out of the country. And all of that was inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it was very clear what the deal was, and it had the force of international law, because you had a UN Security Council resolution that said the Iranians break this deal.
And yet President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say over and over and over again it put Iran on a path to a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and it didn't. I mean, like it actually makes no sense to say that, because they had to roll back their program. Now, two things I'd say, to be fair to the criticisms. One of the criticisms is that certain elements of the deal had durations, right? Certain restrictions on the Iranian program sunsetted in 10 years or 15 years, in terms of like the numbers of centrifuges they could operate. Now, the two things I'd say about that are, number one, that's not uncommon in arms control agreements. So like, we had a New START treaty negotiated with Russia on deployments of, nuclear missiles and launchers. But it's a 10-year phase, and then 10 years later, you renegotiate, right? So there's not a tradition in arms control of like permanent arms control deals. Now, the second and more important thing I'd say, though, Major, is Trump pulled out of the deal in 2018. So all the restrictions went away in 3 years. And Iran started doing all the things that people warned that they might do in 10 years, in 3 years. So I never quite, there was a kind of cognitive dissonance there, that you're blowing up the deal because you don't want them to do things in 10 years, but you're therefore allowing them to enrich at a higher level, allowing them to accumulate a stockpile, and leads to a situation now where the stockpile of enriched uranium they have is much more potent than anything they had in the Obama years. Now, the other thing I'd say is that Netanyahu's criticism of the deal to Congress when he came to the U.S. and gave a speech opposing the deal was that it didn't address ballistic missiles, and it didn't address Iranian support for terrorist proxy groups. And look, that's true, but diplomacy is the art of the possible, and the Iranians were never going to agree to that. Now, fast forward, when Kushner and Witkoff were negotiating before this latest war, they were demanding that the Iranians limit their ballistic missile program and their support for proxies. And of course, the Iranians said no. And that's when Netanyahu convinced Trump, I think, to do this. I think telling him that it would be easy, that the Iranian regime would collapse. And look, we got the same presentation. I was in many a phone call with President Obama where he was talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he was telling him, you shouldn't make this deal. You should use military force. You need a credible military option. And we, we did the war game. And guess what? Every time you did the war game, that's when you sit down and you simulate what might happen. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian regime digs in. It doesn't collapse. Basically, what has happened was eminently predictable. It's anyone who's kind of worked or war gamed on this scenario.
The regime clings to power.
Yeah.
Asymmetric warfare is used,
Yes.
even though it's weakened.
Yeah.
And because of its theocratic devotion to the underpinnings of the revolution, don't give up.
Yes, and because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the hardest core element of the regime, they function not just as a theocratic regime, but as essentially a military dictatorship. And so what's happened now...
A deeply corrupt one.
So in part because of sanctions, they basically have a monopoly on, let's say, the dark economy. Sanctions busting, all kinds of illicit trade. They had their own sources of revenue. And so they operate well in conflict, and
they don't starve, in other words.
They don't starve. And they don't care about their people. I mean, the same reason that they're odious is why they're dangerous, right? Because right now, Trump is trying to blockade Iran and create hardship for the Iranian people so that the regime comes up with their hands out. They don't care if their people suffer for a few months, as long as they can hold the global economy hostage. And so I think the situation Trump finds himself in is probably the best landing place he could find is something kind of like the Obama deal. Like the Iranians reopen the strait, the blockade's lifted, the Iranians get a bunch of revenue from sanctions relief or from tolling the
And
strait.
then there's some sort of 60-day period to negotiate all these other things.
And then you negotiate something kind of like the Iran deal.
And here's more of my conversation with Ben Rhodes about his book and the connective tissue between some of America's most important speeches and how history played out. Please listen. All we say, a history in 15 speeches. Most of the speeches are from long ago. There are some from the modern era, but most predate radio.
Yeah.
Anything that we would commonly associate with mass communication in this country. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I really wanted to go back to the origins of the argument that we've been having in this country, that is so potent right now. I'm a big believer that you have to look to history to understand the present. And as someone who was a speechwriter, not an historian, I also kind of knew that what speeches offer is history in the present tense. This is how people were trying to persuade each other. This is how people are trying to mobilize movements. This is how people are trying to change things. And I wanted to essentially focus on American identity, right? And so what I found is that there are these rich tributaries that run out of kind of the 19th century into today, right? Because I start with Benjamin Franklin, and that's a good starting point for our conversation. He gives a speech at the Constitutional Convention that's the closing argument for the Constitution, in which he notably doesn't mention the Constitution. He mentions the Constitution, but not the substance of it. Right. The entire speech is about compromise and the virtue of compromise. And he says, you get a group of people together in a room, you have all their wisdom, but you also have all their selfish interests, all their prejudices. And you're not going to get a perfect product or agreement out of that. The compromise that he exalted, rightly, made this country possible. But they compromised about big things.
Huge things.
Right? Slavery, the nature of citizenship, immigration, how that's going to work. And so I immediately found that Americans got that. And the first several speeches in the book are the whiplash of the indigenous reaction to that, the abolitionist reaction to that, the Confederate reaction to that, and then Lincoln comes along in the second inaugural, and he's trying to resolve it. And that argument has repeated over and over again, essentially. Now, we're not dealing with slavery, but we're the same questions of identity, of immigration, about
Of power.
Who has power in this country? Yeah.
You can catch my full conversation. It runs well over 30 minutes with Ben Rhodes on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform.